Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installation in our mini documentary about the expulsion of the Acadians. My name is Dr. Robert Aucoin, and I'm an educational consultant, a teacher, an occasional podcaster, and I'm interested really in everything. I want to welcome you to this session. This is tags on to an earlier session we did where we talked about sort of the facts around the expulsion of the Acadians, which is an event that really is key and really important to many populations around the world. But few people outside the Maritimes and Louisiana really know much about it. So if you haven't seen that session, I highly recommend it. I also want to take a few minutes, as I always do, to give a warm thank you to Shaw Communications and Shaw Spotlight for all their support on this panel discussion. Without them, there would really be no such discussions, and so I really appreciate their support in this. As in the previous session, I brought together an eclectic panel of experts to tell a story about the Acadian expulsion. And let me just introduce the members of our panel again. And what we're going to do today is we're going to leave off from some of the facts, and we're actually going to talk about personal stories. So how our families were affected by the expulsion 250 years ago, and how it has affected us into today. But let me start by introducing Susan Surette-Draper is originally from southwest Nova Scotia, but she now resides in the ancient Acadian village of Rivière-au-Canal, which is quite close to Grand-Pré, which we talk quite a lot about because that was the center of the expulsion 250 years ago. And since then, she's been a guide and an interpreter at Grand-Pré National Historic Site of Canada, which really is the preeminent source for all things Acadian in Canada and arguably around the world. Next on our panel, we have Martin Marty Gudry. He's a retired chemist, but is really an Acadian genealogist and historian from Louisiana. He's published numerous articles on Acadian history and genealogy. He's presented seminars on the subject as well as conducted genealogical workshops. Warren Perrin is a lawyer, also from Louisiana, and has also done extensive work reviving interest in Acadian history and culture. And Warren is famous within the Acadian community for leading a campaign to compel Queen Elizabeth II of England to acknowledge and apologize for the Acadians' expulsion from Nova Scotia. So this was a seminal event for Acadians across the globe, and we owe Warren a very large debt for his work on this point. And last but not least, Georges Arsenault is a Canadian historian and folklorist from Prince Edward Island in Eastern Canada. He's published widely about Acadian culture, traditions, and history. So why don't we go ahead and get started with our personal stories? In my case, I won't go into a ton of detail, but I talked a few minutes ago about how I know my father, my father's father, my father's father, and once you get past 3, I don't know how to explain it, but I guess it's like my 5 times grandfather back was named Pierre Aucoin. He and his brothers were in Grand-Pré. One of the brothers was in Cobequid, which is now Truro, which is why I asked Susan if Lenin extended to Cobequid. There was a reason for that. But anyway, I don't think they were deported from Cobequid. They were deported from Grand-Pré, and they eventually wound up in one of these prisons in Bristol, England, as at that point prisoners of war. And I learned so much because I didn't realize that there was and I'm being a little facetious, but I didn't realize there was a detour through Virginia at that point. I actually thought they were deported straight to Bristol, but that wasn't the case. And while Pierre and his brothers were in prison in Bristol, Pierre met a Leblanc woman, Félicité Leblanc, married, started a family. At the end of the war, like so many others, they were deported again to France, northern France, and they met up with a British family, the Robbins family, who were commercial fishermen on the Guernsey Islands, which is just off the coast of France. And they wanted to start a commercial fishery in what's now Canada, the Eastern Maritimes, PEI, Cape Breton, that area. And Pierre and his brother convinced the Robbins family that they knew those fishing areas quite well, and they were hired on. And then they returned. They returned to the Maritimes. So initially to PEI, but within a few years they relocated to what I call Western Cape Breton, Shedikan. And that's where my origins come from. And so it's very interesting for me that I'm able to trace all that stuff through. There's some kind of gaps there. For example, I don't think Pierre had been a fisherman at any point in his life. And so I think there was probably some fast and loose talk with the Robbins family about how well he actually knew the fishing grounds around PEI. He probably didn't know them at all, but the Robbins family wouldn't have known that. So, but anyway, I wanted to get to some of your family stories. And Susan, I wonder if we could come back to you. I don't want to play favorites at all, but I found your story really interesting because it's not part of the traditional deportation narrative, if I can word it that way.
Yeah, maybe that's why I like to make the point that it's not all about deportation. Because actually, as a kid growing up in an Acadian community in southwest Nova Scotia, which is at the tip of Nova Scotia, at the other tip from Shedikan, where you're from, when I was growing up, and I am much younger than you, we didn't call ourselves Acadians, we called ourselves French. And the people next door to us didn't call themselves English or didn't call themselves New England planters. They called themselves English. That was just plain. And no one really talked about Acadians at all. And but we knew we had, we had grandpas like you, somebody, and we knew we weren't, we were a different group. And but by then it was like 7 or 8 generations from the deportation. So my parents, our main Acadian folklore was we were not deported. Yes, we're Acadians, and no, we were not deported. And basically, there was no other details forthcoming. This was before historians really got into it, before schools really taught it, even though I went to a school with all Acadians and the teachers were all Acadians and all of that. It was really not anything we kind of explored. So what happened was, after a life of working in other domains, I ended up as a guide at Grand Pre in my last career, shall we say. And at that point, I was stunned and surprised that there was all kinds of information available. And a lot of it had come into to light with Stephen White's books on genealogy and the work done by Ronnie Gilles Leblanc and others, and Georges, and people who were just in that domain for their whole lives. But to me, it was a discovery at the age of 50. Well, better late than never, right? And so working at Grand Pre, one of the things we were encouraged to do was to incarnate a person in order to greet the visitors and be I'm whoever. And so I thought, who should I pick? And I realized, well, my ancestor, everyone in my community is pretty much a descendant of Pierre Surette and Catherine Bro. And like many people, genealogy is only done on the male side. And because I'm not on the male side, I wanted to kind of look into finding out the story of Pierre Surette and Catherine Bro, not just the one line, but the family. And so because I wanted to find out about that family, I realized that not only do I need those two people, I need to know who their parents are, who their siblings are, and then who their children are. And so the whole thing just grew. And I kept finding really unbelievable information. I found references to my ancestor Pierre Surette in primary documents, which totally blew my mind. I thought, you know, we were just ordinary people who didn't do anything exciting, who were just living and made it to 8 generations and somehow avoided the deportation. But that was it. So it started me on this quest, which it ultimately has culminated into a book, which I'm reading the last pages again before I'll send it to be published. But it's been a really interesting ride. So after that preamble, I'll just tell you quickly their story. Pierre Surette and Catherine Bro were married. They show up, their marriage shows up in the register that Marty alluded to, the Grand Pre register that made it to Saint Gabriel. And that was one of the first things I found out. One of my coworkers said to me, "Oh, they're in the register." Like, really? I'm here at Grand Pre looking at the church. Well, it's the memorial church, but still. And you're telling me my ancestors are in this register? So I found them, and yep, they're there. And so it turns out that Pierre was a young guy from Annapolis Royal. His father had come from France, and his mother was an Acadian, a pèlerin. And he, at the early 20s, he and his brother migrated to La Rivière au Canard, which is the other side of the river from Grand Pre. And he married Catherine Bro, who is a daughter of Pierre Bro. He's on his second marriage with Anne Leblanc. And they have, his first wife had died. And they have a whole family. And so he marries Catherine Bro in 1732. And the couple lived there, presumably in the Canard area as well. That's where the Bros are located. And they lived there for several years. And then they, like a lot of people, take up the opportunity to go and reset or become new settlers on the Petitcodiac River. So I know that's probably ringing some bells for Warren, because if you're a Broussard, you know all about the Petitcodiac. And in fact, Pierre Surette and Joseph Broussard were contemporaries. They were both brought up in Port Royal, so, and they obviously knew each other, had connections all along the history. But basically, Pierre marries Catherine, and her brothers and sisters have already settled along the Petitcodiac, and so they go, and with their young family. They settle there, apparently. Catherine and her sisters are like one village after another, one settlement after another, down the Petitcodiac, down the river, not as far as Le Coude, where you'll find the Broussards, but up river, but not that far up. Anyway, they're there at the time of the deportation. And that had always been kind of a black hole in my story, because how are we not deported? So they were, it turns out, and not very many people had known about that bit. And so that kind of, whoa, all right. So instead of being deported, they escaped into the woods. And during the deportation time, well, Pierre was captured, but he escaped. There's all kinds of comings and goings with that. But basically, they lived in refugee camps for the next 4 years until, as I mentioned, after the fall of Quebec. And after the fall of Quebec in particular, and after a devastating hurricane that happened and wiped out everything on the coast, they turned themselves in. After that happened, then they were moved to Fort Edward in Windsor, where they are listed on the lists, the official lists of prisoners, with the Broussards, by the way, and many others, as prisoners in 1762 in Fort Edward. And so they stay there for a few years. The conditions are questionable. Fort Edward is small. There were quite a few prisoners, so obviously they were mainly like probably under guard, or had to report at certain times. They were also, while they were there, the New England planters had arrived in Nova Scotia, and coming from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, they had not a sweet clue what to do with dike lands. And so the Acadians, who were prisoners of war, were hired for 5 shillings a day to teach the new settlers how to manage the diking system. Because of course they had been promised the most fertile land ever. And so when they got here, as a result of hurricanes, that what they saw were flooded fields. And so they petitioned the government for help. The Acadians were hired at a small pittance to teach them how to farm those lands, which, by the way, they still do today. And even though with modern equipment, still the same system. So, but for the Acadians, it was a way to make money and a way to save your money. So because the famous communities stay together, and the family of Pierre and Catherine, by the time they get to Fort Edward, their children are adults. They begin to have families themselves. And then the war is over. And they say, well, what do we do now? We can stay. We're not ready to go with the people that are going with the Broussard gang. We are not, we're still staying. We're not sure what we're doing, but we're not ready to give up. And so they stay. Now the government in Fort Edward is a little kind of like, come on, you guys, we can't feed you forever. We only have, like 2 loaves of bread to share, blah, blah, whatever. So in the end, they decide they will settle in Chesapeake, which is just outside of Halifax. And it's still an Acadian community today. And in Chesapeake is a way where they kind of regroup. So members of the family decide to go to New Brunswick, southern New Brunswick, Kokang, say for instance. But most of the Pierre Surette family, except for one, all decide to settle in Cap-Sab in the Yarmouth area, Saint-Anne-du-Ruisseau, Pubnico, that kind of area. And but of course, like someone said, in Louisiana, they got lots of help and lots of encouragement and all of that. Well, in Nova Scotia, it was not so. So when they decided, there were only certain places where they could settle, and it had to be away from other Acadian communities. And they were not given land. They had to pay rent to one of, in their first land allotment came from the Reverend Brainton, who was the Anglican priest who was in favor in Halifax, and he'd been given concessions of land. And so when you were given a concession, it seems that you had, there were stipulations, you had to improve it. And he was looking for people, he couldn't really get any New Englanders or any British to come fast enough. So he rented it to the Acadians. And when they got there, they decided this was where they would stop. There were Acadians in Pubnico, which is not very far away. In Pierre's case, some of his sisters, in fact, had returned from exile in Massachusetts and had made it back home, and they were in that general area as well. And so they settled there. Now that was Pierre's story, but when the deportation happened and everybody was scattered everywhere, Catherine Bro had a whole different story. Whereas Pierre was able to reconnect with some of his brothers and sisters throughout, Catherine Bro was separated from her whole family. Her parents were deported to Massachusetts, where he died in Braintree. Her 3 brothers were also deported to Massachusetts. They ended up settling in Quebec after the deportation, when they were allowed to return. Her sister Brigitte joined the Broussard group when they left. She had married a Thibodeau. And so really, when the deportation happened, deportations happened and all of the upheaval, then she remained the only person left in her family to stay in Nova Scotia. And she's the mother of all the Surettes in Southwest Nova Scotia.
That's amazing.
That's my story.
Yeah.
If you want more, you'll have to read my book.
Oh, I'd like to do that actually. So you'll have to, when it's published, make sure you send me the title so I can.
Yeah.
And I know this isn't funny, but I just have this picture in my head of these New Englanders coming from Pennsylvania or wherever to take over the lands in and around Grand Pré, what you call Les Mines. And of course, it's flooded and the dikes are broken because of the hurricane and just disuse and so on. And so, okay, Acadians, come over and fix the dikes. And they're probably thinking, a couple of weeks to fix the dikes and then we're good. But no, once that land, it's salt water. Once that land is flooded, It's
Yeah.
years to reclaim that land.
Yes,
Years.
but if it hasn't been flooded for a long time, it can take up to 5 years when you first set up a dike. But if it hadn't been flooded for, I mean, some of them would have been worse than others. And then it's always kind of a gradient. So presumably some lands weren't as bad as others, that type of thing. So, but definitely for sure, it's a heart-wrenching proposition.
Yeah.
But yet people do what they have to survive.
Absolutely, absolutely. Georges, I think you're being from PEI. I think your story is a little bit different as well. Would you mind sharing?
Well, there are so many stories to be told, and many of them I just discovered them over the last 10, 15 years. And I found out that some of my ancestors had been deported to France. One family from Grand Pré to England, and then from there to France. And one of my ancestors met a girl who had been deported from Prince Edward Island, and they married there and eventually came back to the Maritimes. But there are many of my ancestors who were not deported, who escaped deportation, and one of them even escaped 2 deportations, and that's Pierre Poirier. My mother was a Poirier, or in fact, she was a Perry, but the Perrys on the island, most of them are really Poirier. And it started with this Pierre Poirier, who was born in 1733 in the Beaubassin area. And in 1754, he was living with his family in Tintamarre, near where Sackville is today. And he married a woman called Marguerite de Giroir in 54. 55, after the Fort Beauséjour was taken by the British, they called upon all the men 15 years old and over to come to a meeting at the fort, because they were going to give them information about land. And when they got there, it was like in Grand Pré, they were made prisoners. And eventually a group of the prisoners were sent to the closest British fort, which was Fort Amherst. Not Fort Amherst, but Fort, I'm looking for the name, Fort Lawrence, located near Amherst, Nova Scotia. So here they were, a whole bunch of men, and their women were allowed to bring them food. And one day, according to research that was done over 100 years ago by Acadian genealogist and historian Placide Godet, he interviewed the elders who had heard these stories. Anyways, some of the men told the women, well, next time you come, hide a knife in one of the loaves of bread. So with that knife, and maybe more than one, they managed, those prisoners, to dig a 12-foot tunnel through which they could escape. So at the end of September, around the last of September, 1st of October, I guess there was a hurricane, and they took advantage of that, and they had made that tunnel, and 86 of those men managed to escape. And one of them was my ancestor, Pierre Poirier. So of course they wanted to find their families. Pierre was, his wife was expecting. She was almost 9 months pregnant. So he went to Tintamarre, and all the population was gone, all the women and the children and the elders. But he met some Micmacs. They said, oh, they're gone to Cocagne. They're waiting there to be sent over to Ile Saint-Jean, to Prince Edward Island. So he made his way there. We don't know if their first baby was born in Cocagne or on Ile Saint-Jean. But on the 15th of August, his wife, Marguerite, gave birth to Rosalie. And we know that they went to the island because she was baptized at Port-la-Joie a month later, at the end of November. So he was safe. There was lots of people from his home area that were already on the island. We don't know exactly where they went to settle. So that was in 1755, the year that the deportation started. Now, the island was still French, and the population by 1758 was over 4,000 Acadians. A few thousands had come from mainland Nova Scotia and southern New Brunswick over the years, as many of them as refugees. So they stayed there. But then there was the 1758 deportation when Louisbourg was taken by the British and surrendered. Automatically, the island surrendered because it was a satellite colony of Cape Breton. So Lord Rollo came in with 500 men from Louisbourg, and their mission was to round up the population and deport them to France. But fortunately, about 1,100, 1,200 of the Acadians on the island managed to escape to the mainland. And one of those families was my ancestor, Pierre Poirier. And probably he first went with his small family to a refugee camp on the Miramichi River. And from there, in 59 or 50 or 60, went to the other camp on the Ristigouche River. So we know that he went there, like many other Acadians, especially from Prince Edward Island. And then after the last battle that was fought at Ristigouche in 1760, some Acadians were taken prisoners, as was mentioned. They were brought to either Fort Beauséjour, or they went to Fort Edward or Halifax. But then there's a group that hid for a while, and then they were recruited by a British entrepreneur who was looking for fishermen to fish cod for him. So they were brought to Prince Edward Island, to Ile Saint-Jean, and we find him at the Havre Saint-Pierre, St. Peter's Harbor. A list of those Acadians who were there was found not long ago, but 10 years ago. And he is there. Pierre Poirier is here with his wife, his father, his brother, and they stay there for a while. And Pierre is a young man. He's in his 20s. And of course, he can work. So the British there, from Fort Amherst, they needed people to work for them to clear the land in where Charlottetown would be built, and they would pay them a little bit of money. So we know that he was one of them, and also cutting wood for a private entrepreneur. And then what happened was that his name, Poirier, most of the English didn't understand what he was saying. It sounded a bit like Perry. So he became known as Pierre Perry. And that name he kept, and many of his descendants kept that name. Then finally, around 1770, Pierre Poirier moves to the head of Malpeque Bay, because the island had been divided into 67 lots and given out to British people who had fought in the war or had served the government. So they became absentee landlords. So the Acadians on the island tried to sell. They had to become, they couldn't buy their land, and they moved around quite a bit. And Pierre, from Havre Saint-Pierre, went to Malpeque Bay, and from there, we don't know where he died, possibly around Tignish, but some of his children settled in Tignish, and they were Perrys. That's where my mother came from that area. Others went to the Montcabel, and that's where his life ended. But then, what is very interesting is that among his ancestors, among his descendants, some of them became very prominent. For instance, the first Acadian born in Acadia after the deportation to become a priest, a Catholic priest, was his grandson, Sylvain Ephraim Poirier, who preferred to go under the name Perry, like his great-grandfather, but he spelled it P-E-R-R-E-Y. And then another descendant was the first Acadian who was elected to the Legislative Assembly on the island. His name was Stanislas Perry, and he also went by Perry. And also, Stanislas Perry became the first Acadian to be elected to the House of Commons from the Maritime Provinces. And one of his grandsons became a very popular premier, I should say, of Nova Scotia. His name was MacDonald. And he also became a prominent minister in the federal government during the Second World War. And in fact, when you were in Halifax and you wanted to go on the bridge to Dartmouth, the first bridge was named after him, MacDonald, a descendant of this Pierre Poirier, who escaped the British twice. And so there are many, many, many descendants of this Pierre Poirier now in Prince Edward Island, in Canada in general, and a lot of them in the United States, because we had a lot of immigration starting in the middle of the 19th century to New England.
Yeah.
So that's one story of many, many stories about how individuals or families managed to survive. Many of them died, though, because of the 3,000 that were deported from Prince Edward Island to France. Only about half of them died during the crossing, either by ships sinking or by sickness. And many others died in France because when they arrived there, they were not very healthy. And so we say that about half or a third, only about a third of those that were deported from Prince Edward Island in 1758 to France survived.
Yeah.
And many of them were among those who left in 1785 from France to settle in Louisiana. So I've been to Louisiana a few times, and I often meet some people who say, oh yes, my ancestors lived in Prince Edward Island for a while, and they always want to know where they were and if we are connected. So that's my little story.
Well, and speaking of the connections, I mean, you talked, it sounds very similar to my own story. You talked about a British family that was trying to create a commercial fishery in Prince Edward Island. Do you remember the family name? Was it the Robbins family?
No, I forget the name, but it was not the Robins. The Robins didn't come to the island. They went to the Gaspé, Northern New Brunswick, and Cape Breton. But I have one of my ancestors is a Barriot, and he was deported to France. And eventually he was recruited by the Robins from the Jersey Island to come and fish cod in Carleton, the Gaspé Peninsula. And from there, his grandson or great-grandson came to Prince Edward Island, and two of his daughters married two of my great-great-grandfathers. So that's one link of a family that was deported to France that came back with this British entrepreneur, the Robins.
Yeah, well, and based on my reading, the Robbins family did establish, they started a commercial fishery in PEI, but I don't think they stayed initially very long. You're right, they relocated to Cape Breton fairly quickly.
Yes, I don't know that they came to the island. There are some British entrepreneurs, but we know that the Robins for sure were in Chitican, were on Ile Madame, and they were also in the Gaspé and Northern New Brunswick.
Yeah, and they're still around, actually. I went to school with some of them, but Marty, but what I'd be interested, I don't think we ever talked about your personal story. What is your personal story?
Well, first I'll say that like Warren, I was influenced by Dudley LeBlanc also, who was a state senator. And when I graduated from the same school as Warren, but I was a few years after Warren, maybe one, but at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, which was then called University of Southwestern Louisiana. I had a few days before the commencement exercises, and so I went to the library, and I didn't know anything about Acadians. I knew Cajuns, and I knew that we had Cajuns. Didn't know I was Acadian, though. And I picked up a book called The Acadian Exile by Dudley LeBlanc and started reading it and saw my name in it. It started me off, and since 1970, I've been researching the Acadians and my family and everything ever since that day. Not unbeknown to me at that time is Dudley LeBlanc only lived about 2 miles from my house. And it was interesting. My mother knew him well. My mother used to go to ride to USL. It was called Southwestern Louisiana Institute then, with his daughter every day. They go to school together, but I didn't personally know him. But they had a couple interesting stories about Lud Dudley. He's about the only guy I know that got rich losing elections because he used to do a radio show on Sundays in French, and all of the Acadians in the area in Vermilion Parish and all would listen to it. And so he'd always run the first primary. He'd lose, but he always had 10% of the state electorate behind him. And if he got on his radio show and say, vote for Joseph Broussard, 10% of the state of Louisiana would vote for Joseph Broussard. So when they got to the second primary election and they had two people running, they both paid Dudley LeBlanc to support him. And whoever gave him the most, he would support him. And he got pretty wealthy doing that. He also got wealthy because he was a little inventor, and he invented a elixir, I guess you call it, called Hadacol. And some people asked him one time, why'd you call it Hadacol? He said, because I had to call it something. But it was actually all for that reason. It was a Happy Days Company LeBlanc, Hadacol. And he was on Groucho Marx one day. And Groucho Marx says, "What good was Hadacol?" He said, "Well, it was good for $5 million for me last year." And so he was quite a salesman and all, Dudley LeBlanc was. And Hadacol actually was not a quack drug or anything. I think he actually had some value. Back then, it was full of a lot of vitamins, and people didn't get vitamins back then. And so they would take it and they would feel better because they were getting vitamins at that time. Now we take one a day and different vitamins.
Right.
So anyway, I learned from Dudley LeBlanc about Acadians and a little bit about my family, and I started studying it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my ancestor, who was a third generation Acadian by the name of Pierre Gudry. Back then, we spelled our name G-U-E with an accent, D-R-Y. I think it was accent aigu, if I'm not mistaken. And I always entitle my talk An Exile of Hopes and Heartbreaking Tragedies. And because that's how his life was. It was an up and down thing all throughout his life. I always want to say he was resilient, and I think all Acadians are resilient. You find that throughout. That's why we survived, because we were resilient. Yeah. If you look at the recent hurricanes we've had, and exclude Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, because New Orleans isn't Acadian, but the rest of them that we had, Rita and Gustav and all of those, you find that the Acadians came back without government help. They immediately helped each other and got back on their feet. And that's how we always, I think all Acadians have been. Pierre came originally, the first Gudry we had was Claude Gudry. Came to Nova Scotia, or Acadia then, sometime between 1671 and 1680. Because the first record we have is his daughter was being baptized on the mouth of the St. John River. We don't know if he was married to this woman, but it was a Mi'kmaq by the name of Keskua, and his daughter was named Jean Gudry on June of 1681. That's our first record. So we know he got there at 1680 or before. He wasn't in the census of 1671, so it's sometime in that time frame. So a lot of people don't consider the Gudrys Acadians because they didn't appear in the 1671 census, but I would argue that they are Acadian. They lived their lives there till they were deported out of Acadia. Around 1698, Claude had a son named Augustin who married Jean Hebert, and eventually they had a child. They had 8 children. The youngest was Pierre Gudry. He married a young woman by the name of Marguerite Dupuy, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. I wanted to get back to Claude first. Claude married a woman by the name of Catherine Bucaret, and she and Claude moved to a little town called Mirlegesh, which is just out of Lunenburg, about, I want to say miles, maybe 35 miles, which would be what, 60 kilometers, something on that order. People say, well, why did they move there? Because if you know Catherine Bucaret's father, it was Claude. Claude was a clerk of court, very well-educated man for Port Royal, but his children apparently were not educated per se, but they were very intelligent. One of them was offered a scholarship to Harvard University later in life, one of his grandchildren. But anyway, they moved to Mirlegesh because Catherine Bucaret's grandfather was Bernard Bucaret. And her father was Bernard Bucaret, who was given a royal grant to the lands where Lunenburg are today. So they got free land. And you say, well, they didn't care about that. Well, yeah, people cared about economics back then, just like they do now. So
always about land.
Yeah. So they moved to Mirlegesh. We actually have a document of talking about that, of him being given that land grant. Around early 40s, Pierre Gudry was born to Augustin Gudry and Jean Hebert, and at Mirlegesh, and he lived there his young life. If you ever been to Lunenburg, it's a beautiful area right on Lunenburg Bay, and really pretty area, hilly country. 1750, Father Leloutre came around and threatened the Acadians, saying that the British were in Halifax, the British were going to come and rape their women, kill the children, take the land, and they better leave. He also indicated from some things I've read that he was going to have the Mi'kmaq attack them. Now, the Acadians in Mirlegech had lived with the Mi'kmaq. There were around 300 Mi'kmaq, somewhere around 50 to 100 Acadians, and they had lived close together. They had intermarried with some of the Acadians there. In fact, two of the Gudrys married half Mi'kmaq women there. So there was a close relationship between them. But they were scared, and they did leave. In around 1750, Pierre and his siblings and aunts and uncles ended up going, most of them to what's today Sydney, North Sydney, Cape Breton. Back then it was Baie d'Espagnol, and settled there. We find him in the census of 1752. Pierre was a young boy, somewhere around 10, 11 years old, living with his sister, Ursule, and her husband, Paul Boutin. And two of his other siblings, young ones, were living with their older siblings on the island there. They stayed there until 1754 in August, and they were starving to death. If you've ever farmed in Cape Breton, that area, you find out that the soil is awful. You can't make a living. The French had supported them for a couple years, but they had ended the support that in 1754. So being good boatsmen, they got a boat and they came back to Lunenburg and asked the British if they could resettle the old lands at Mirlegech. And they agreed to let them do that. So they moved back to their old lands there just above Lunenburg and settled there. They even victualled them, gave them food in 1755. We have the victual list. There were 50 Acadians. About 25 of them came in August of 1754. All of those, except for two, were directly related to Pierre Gudry. They were his brothers, sisters, brother-in-laws, sister-in-laws, and children. There were two that weren't. Those two eventually left and went back to Cape Breton. But the rest of them stayed. And in October 1754, another 25 came for the same reason and settled in Mirlegech. And they were cousins of Pierre Gudry and his family. So the whole group of 50 were pretty closely related. A couple of them went back to Cape Breton. We know that one of the sisters of Pierre Gudry went back and died and is buried at the cemetery at Louisburg, along with a couple of her young children. But most of them stayed. All of a sudden in September 1755, the British changed course. They went to Mirlegech and arrested all of the Acadians there, all 50. Put them on the Jolly Bacchus, a little tender, brought them over to George's Island and imprisoned them there. They were imprisoned in a couple of warehouses on the western edge of George's Island. We do have now drawings of that we recently discovered of those warehouses on the western end. They stayed there. They only had the clothes on their back from October through December. They had no shelter except the old warehouse, which was dilapidated. Fortunately, there were some French soldiers or sailors that had been imprisoned there, and they did have quarters for those sailors. But they were fenced off from those sailors, so they couldn't go to those. But the sailors would occasionally throw them food, some clothing that they might have in excess to keep them alive. They all survived. And in December of 1755, they were put on the Providence, and they were the first Acadians to be deported from George's Island. And they were brought to North Carolina. We don't know the exact area they were brought to, but we're pretty sure we have a lot of circumstantial evidence that they were brought to Edenton, North Carolina, which is a port city on the sound there, Albemarle Sound. Why do we think that? Well, the captain of the ship was Captain Samuel Brown. He had a house on the opposite side of Albemarle Sound from Edenton. Edenton happened to be a huge port city at that time, the major port city in the area. So and we also know from a couple of records of the legislature that they gave some money to the Acadians in Chowan County, which is that county that the Sound, that Edenton's in. So it looks like they were in Edenton. One of the Acadians did well, by the name of Augustin Duchamp. He married a little girl by the name of Elizabeth White, whose father was fairly wealthy there, and he ended up making a life in that area. The other Acadians in 1760 time frame left and decided to leave, probably after the Battle of Montreal. That when Montreal fell, I think the handwriting was on the wall They were not being held by the North Carolinians anymore, and they left. They probably went by roads. There were dirt roads that led up to Philadelphia and Maryland at that time. They might have had an ox cart that they were able to get, but they walked, and some of them went up into Maryland, Baltimore, in that area, and some went to Philadelphia. My ancestor Pierre, we know, ended up in Philadelphia because we find him there in a couple cases. There was a Catholic church in Philadelphia called St. Joseph's, founded in 1730s, and he appears in the church records as the parrain of 2 or 3 of his nieces and nephews. He actually probably was in northern northern New Jersey, because there was a house there called the Geiger House. And although it was illegal to be a Catholic and have services in New Jersey, the Geiger's family allowed their house to be used, and twice a year a missionary from Philadelphia would go down and celebrate masses and all. And that's where we find his name, at ceremonies that occurred in the Geiger House. The house is still there today. It's privately owned and lived in. You can still go and visit it if you'd like. It's on Salem County, New Jersey. So from there in 1763, we find his name on a list of Acadians that want to go back to France. After the English Acadians went to France and found out that maybe they could go, a lot of the Acadians in North America put together a list to France to ask to be able to go back. Of course, none of them were allowed to, but they're on that list. Sometime in the mid-60s, he went to Port Tobacco, Maryland. He had a brother there, Jean-Baptiste Gudry, who was in Port Tobacco. Jean-Baptiste appeared on the 1763 list for Port Tobacco and then died shortly afterwards. But his widow with 5 children was there. So we think Pierre probably went to see the widow. And in 1767 in December, the widow and her children, Anne Dupuy Gudry and her 5 children, along with Pierre Gudry and his wife, Marguerite Dupuy, and their young daughter, Marie, boarded the Jane ship and sailed to New Orleans and got there in February of 68. They spent a month in New Orleans, and I mentioned earlier, they were told they had to go to Fort St. Louis de Natchez. And they fought it, but they ended up going. Pierre lost his wife, his daughter, and a newborn son there in the summer of 1768. So he was a widower in his 20s. He, one of the other people that went there was a lady by the name of Catherine Babin, and he ended up marrying her in Point Coupé Parish, because we had no church up in St. Louis de Natchez. So they took it's interesting, they took a boat with 2 other couples and 1 adult male man who was older, and sailed down to Point Coupé, about 60 miles downriver, got married at Point Coupé, the 3 couples, and went back upriver. And somebody said, why the old man? And I think it's because probably took a little while to go downriver, and they didn't want any marriages consummated before they were actually married. So so they were married at Point Coupé Parish, which, by the way, no Acadians were allowed to settle in. That was the one parish you could not settle in if you were Acadian, because it was already settled by the French, and they wanted the Acadians to settle new regions. Right. But they could get married there at the church, at St. Francis Church, and they were. So he got married in 1769 in January to Catherine Babin. In December, they had a revolt in 1768. The Germans and the Acadians went to New Orleans in October of 1768 and threatened Ulloa. The Ulloa decided it might be best if he did not hang around New Orleans too much longer. He took his family, fled to a ship 1st of November, and went back to France. And it wasn't until later the next year, when O'Reilly showed up as governor, that they settled that revolt. And O'Reilly ended up hanging 6 Germans, but no Acadians. And but the thing that sort of broke the camel's back was the Acadians that had to go to St. Louis de Natchez. So in December of 69, O'Reilly said the Acadians could leave. They did. And Pierre went down to Ascension Parish and spent a few years there in Louisiana, to St. Landry Parish in Opelousas. He and Catherine had 6 children, but again, another heartbreaking incident. She died in childbirth with the 6th child, so he lost his second wife. The child survived. I descend from Catherine, that wife. A couple years later, he married a 3rd time to Marguerite Miller. He didn't marry again this time. He married an English woman, and or a German woman, I should. And they stayed St. Matthew Parish until the early 1790s, and then he was able to buy 2 pieces of land in St. Martin Parish on the Bayou Teche, 250 by 40 arpent pieces of land, paid 110 cows for them, which he didn't have, but they were able to buy them on time. And eventually he started a vacherie in St. Martin Parish and was able to pay Madame de Clouet her 110 cows for that land. He had 15 children with Margarita, so he had a total of 22 children during his life. And you would think that would make you destitute by itself, but it didn't. His vacherie survived very well. He died at 83 years old. When he died, he had $110,000 in cash and property. Today, that's worth close to $3 million in today's dollars, and was called the Grand Patriarch of Grand Point, which is what Cecilia, Louisiana was called back then. And so that's pretty much his life. But I'd say that he went through a lot of turmoil in his life, but he always came through at the end.
Yeah, life definitely wasn't easy. And I noticed 2 things. Well, one thing in particular that you mentioned is your reference to Père Leloup. I don't know a lot about this guy, but he seems to pop up a lot, and usually not in very positive ways. I think someone needs to do a book about this man. But anyway, if maybe someone already has. Warren. I don't know what your story is either. Would you mind sharing?
Sure. Although my name is
Warren. Warren's a Perret, but all of his ancestors, except for one, is a Broussard.
Right.
I think you go to either your grandparents or your great-grandparents, everyone's a Broussard except your father's family. Is that right, Warren?
That's correct. And I married a Broussard. So
And you
my
married a
children are 99% Broussard. And I think they inherited the hard head that Beausoleil Broussard had. I briefly mentioned that Beausoleil died shortly after arriving. But in the short time that he was in Louisiana, from February 1765 till his death in October, a lot of wonderful things happened. Number one, he was named commandant of the Attakapaw territory, which was equivalent of being the governor of this area. So to think he left a prison camp on St. George's Island and became commandant of the Attakapaw territories is pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. Another thing that he accomplished, along with other Acadian leaders, they negotiated a Dauterive cattle compact. So New Orleans had a shortage of meat, and they couldn't get settlers to come to the Attakapaw because the Attakapaw Indians were reputed to be man-eaters. Every couple of years, they ate somebody, and it was a very effective way of keeping settlers out of the area. So the Acadians, of course, having been close to the Mi'kmaq, were not deterred. And so this contract that was signed brought the Acadians to the Attakapaw to raise cattle. And as soon as they got there, they reneged on the contract. They totally ignored it. And they didn't engage in sharecropping because there were so many cattle available that were wild, that had migrated from Mexico. And they quickly got in the cattle business and were bringing cattle in cattle drives from the Attakapaw to Louisiana 100 years before Texas even existed. So I love to tell my cousins from Texas that the first cowboys in America were not in Texas, they were the Acadians. And my family is still in the cattle business today. I've inherited our farm in southern Vermilion Parish, which floods just about every hurricane. And Emile Broussard, who would have been the great-great-grandson of Beausoleil, claimed lands, the wetlands of Louisiana, and used the same diking techniques that he obviously had learned from the Acadians' ancestors. And we have a 2,000-acre tract today, which is grazing land for cattle, which has been reclaimed from the marshlands of South Louisiana. So it's just nice to see that legacy continue in Louisiana. About 2012, we had a Broussard family reunion, and a professor from UL named Dr. David Reese made a presentation on how it would be really neat to find Beausoleil Broussard's burial site, because we didn't know where these Acadian pioneers were buried. It was lost to history. And so that caused the Broussard family to launch a project which is now called the New Acadia Project. And for the last 8 years, we have raised money and donated it to the University of Louisiana, specifically dedicated to support Dr. Reese's archaeology project. And we have not publicly announced, but Dr. Reese is compiling a report which probably will be released this year, where he will opine where the first Acadian settlement was located in the Attakapaw territories. We do know it was on the Bayou Teche, because references are made when the priest came bury Beausoleil's brother Alexandre, and 34 of these Acadian leaders. They hadn't yet established villages. They were living in temporary camps. So the priest referenced where he had buried them in the different camps along the Bayou Teche. But we have already erected a historical marker, which we unveiled in October of last year, where we believe it will be near the present day town of Laurelville on the Bayou Teche. I want to circle back to where we briefly touched on how the Acadians were helped so much by the colonial governments of France and Spain. Incredibly, the French had enough sway to keep the Napoleonic Civil Code as the civil law of Louisiana. And that's a remarkable achievement. We still have it today. We are the only state in the United States with the civil code of Napoleon, as is Quebec, the only province in Canada that does not have the British common law. They had enough political sway to keep their civil law similar. And those documents are very, very similar to this day. In fact, when Louisiana petitioned to become a state in 1812, we had to translate the laws into English to be able to apply to become a state. So we have this strong, strong tradition, this Francophone tradition in Louisiana. And I think when we talk about the Acadians coming to Louisiana from France, the best and most recent book by Professor Mouot, I think it's entitled Acadian Refugees. He brings up a part of our history which I had never thought about. These Acadians that were repatriated to France had been living in France for nearly 30 years. They had established relationships. They had married locals, but they resisted assimilating into French society because they considered themselves non-French. They considered themselves Acadian, a distinct people, a new ethnicity. They called themselves different. And France wanted to keep them there because they knew they were good workers, and they knew that they had to entice them. And it was mentioned that some of them were given lands. The first time the King of England ever gave a peasant an acre of land was given to the Acadians on Belle-Île-aux-Mers. to hopefully keep them there. The first time welfare, as we know it today, government help to individuals, was established for the Acadians who were languishing in these ports. A lot of them refused to work because they kept clamoring to be allowed to go back to North America. They would not re-immerse themselves into French society or culture. So stop and think for 1 second. When all of a sudden, in 1785, they are given permission, a bargain is struck, and in some way, Spain wanted to get them to Louisiana. They reimbursed part of the welfare that the French government had given to them. And these Acadians all of a sudden had to decide, do I go back to North America? Do I cross the ocean again? Do I start a new life? Do I tear myself away from perhaps my boyfriend, my husband? They had to make, again, these horrible decisions. And we know now by the records of the 7 ships that brought these nearly 2,000 Acadians to Louisiana in 1 year. It was mostly the young, the elderly, most of those elected to stay, or those who had married French stayed, but the rest of them came to Louisiana. I want to fast forward now from 1765, when Beausoleil gets here and dies. For 150 years, there was no communication, correspondence between Acadians of the world and Cajuns of Louisiana. The poem Evangeline ended the century of silence. It caused Acadians to want to re-examine their history. The same thing started happening in Louisiana. And finally, a man who has been mentioned twice here today, Dudley J. LeBlanc, organized the first time Cajuns went back to Nova Scotia. And they went in 1930 for the 175th anniversary at Grand Pré to commemorate the deportation. And I'm going to show you a book that Mary and I published based upon that trip. We were given a diary of one of the girls that made that famous trip in 1930. It was a 17-day train trip organized by Senator Dudley LeBlanc. He had an ulterior motive. It wasn't just to revisit his ancestors. He was announcing his run to become governor of Louisiana. He did not succeed. He was defeated. But the legacy that LeBlanc leaves us is this first reunification of Cajuns with their Acadians. And one of the 25 Evangeline girls selected for the trip was placed in the homes of Acadians around Grand Pré. And she got to know the LeBlanc family. And she slept in the bedrooms of the LeBlanc family. And in her diary, which we edited for this book called Seeking an Acadian Nation, she comments, "My cousins in Canada are much poorer than we in Louisiana." So that got me curious to compare why the Acadians in the Maritime provinces seemed to this young girl, Corinne Broussard, a descendant of Beausoleil Broussard, to remark how economically more advanced the Cajuns were. And if you look at the Depression, and 1930 was in the depths of the Depression, and both areas suffered greatly, but clearly the Maritimes appear to have suffered more economically than Louisiana did. I believe we had the luxury of having natural resources of petroleum, natural gas, oil, the fishing industry, which allowed them to prosper a little better economically. So what happened to us in Louisiana, having received all of this governmental help, the government turns on us. Actually, we turned on ourselves. We passed a law in Louisiana, making it against the law to speak our native language, French. We did this to ourselves. to try to make the children become Americanized, having a better chance. As my older brother could not speak a word of English, when he started school, he was punished. And my parents didn't want the same thing to happen to me. When my father returned from World War II, il parlait seulement français quand il a parti. When he left to go to the war and fight in the South Pacific, he only spoke French. But when he returned, he could speak English. And he often said, j'ai parti en Cajun, j'ai revenu un Américain. So he left as a Cajun. He didn't leave as an American, but he came back a proud American. So that was a pivotal turning point where Cajuns, for the first time, felt part of the American society. And then in 1964, the Newport Jazz Festival and Folk Festival invited Cajun musicians who had performed in the back of rooms of bars and dance halls and in people's houses. The language was kept alive through the music. And they were invited to this big festival. And for the first time, people applauded them singing in French. And they came home. Dewey Balfour spent the rest of his life telling the Cajuns, be proud. And that sparked a revolution, creating the Council for Development of French in Louisiana in 1968, spurred by the Civil Rights Act in America, led by the African Americans claiming their civil rights. It made Acadians and Cajuns in Louisiana clamor for our rights. And we got the Constitution changed in 1974, giving us the right to speak French and learn French in our schools. And today, we have French immersion in over 34 schools. And I had the pleasure and honor of serving under 5 governors as president of the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana. Now, why is Cajun so much more popular than Acadian, the word? My opinion, we hosted the World's Fair in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1984. We were just on the cusp of the Acadians and the French Renaissance. And we started having pride in the culture, pride in the music, pride in the cuisine, the art. People like Paul Prudhomme became a famous chef. He was on Johnny Carson. We had artists creating the Blue Dog, George Rodriguez, the music, and the food, and the food, and the food. And so we're still enjoying this Renaissance where the world can't get enough of this Cajun culture, which is hip, joined, lockstep with our Acadian ancestors in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, and of course, Quebec. But don't forget, there might be as many descendants of Acadians in Texas than there are in Louisiana. Because you open phone books in that part of the state between Louisiana and Houston, Texas, there were huge immigrations taking place during World War I, World War II. They went to Texas to build the petrochemical plants, to fight the wars, build the ships, and get good paying jobs in those facilities. There were so many Cajuns leaving their farms in Louisiana in the 30s and 40s. People would board up their little houses, des cabanes dans la campagne, their simple little shanties. They were boarding them up and they were writing on the front door, GTO. And it stood for Gone to Texas. You want to find me? I'm going to be in Texas. There's more Broussards in the phone book in Houston, Texas than Lafayette, Louisiana. So we're all over. On est comme des fromés. We're like ants. We're all over. And we're very proud to be a part of this great community of Acadians where it can be found all over the world.
Warren, I found in some documents from the 1700s that the Acadians also call themselves the Cadiens. And in Quebec, they use the term Cadiens, les petites caddies. So I think that the word Cajun could be the anglicized version of Cajun, the Cajun. And but today in French Canada, often when they want to talk about the Cajuns, they say les Cajuns. And I know many Cajuns in Louisiana don't. They said, don't say that. We're not the Cajuns. We're the Cadiens or Acadiens.
Yeah. I have stated oftentimes, and I briefly touched on this, that the Acadians developed a whole new ethnicity in North America, and people have challenged me. What proof do you have that you're a new ethnicity? As a lawyer, I've got to have jurisprudence. I've got to have case law to back it up, and I do. In 1980, there was a proud Cajun from Crowley, Louisiana, named Calvin Roach, and he was working for a big company called Dresser Industries. He was an engineer, and they made fun of him because, you know, we have this little accent that people say is a little strange, but we love it. I never could say thumbtacks. I say this, those, that, and them. And they made fun of him, and he started complaining, and they started calling him the pejorative kunas. And he said, don't do that. Stop it. And he gave them fair warning. And they continued making fun of his accent. And he contacted a lawyer in Lafayette, Louisiana in 1979. He filed a lawsuit under the Civil Rights Act, which protects ethnic minorities in America against invidious discrimination. So to be protected, you have to prove you're not American. Your ethnicity is non-American. And he won his case. Federal court in Lake Charles, Louisiana, examined the history of the Cajuns and said he ticked off every characteristic of nationhood, race, ethnicity. And he checked off language, history, culture, location, ethnicity. And he ruled that we are a protected minority in America. So pretty cool.
Wow.
That is amazing. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like in Louisiana, you've gone a lot further than we have here. I mean, I think we've made pretty good progress here. If you could, just in my generation, because I was raised in Halifax, basically as an Anglophone, even though my parents were very Francophone. And I had to relearn my language as a teenager when we moved back to Shedica, and it was very difficult. And so that's why my kids go to French school. So actually, my kids speak better French than I do. But now it's not like that. You know, like I always ask my parents, like, why didn't you send me to French school or have me speak French? And they basically said, look, you were raised in the 1960s and the 1970s. This was not a good time to be a Francophone in Canada. And so we were not going to inflict that on you. But now in the 2000s, it's completely different. We cannot build French immersion schools and French schools fast enough in this country. You know? The demand is so high. And it's high among non-Francophones, which is particularly pleasing. So I'm really excited about the progress that we've made. It sounds like in Louisiana, maybe you've made more progress than we have, but so I think maybe we have a lot to learn from you guys down there. I'm just going to wrap up here, at least with the recording part of this, by thanking you all so much. I mean, as I said at the top, your expertise or expertises are really valuable, and I'm learning so much. I'm relatively new to the kind of historian part of this and the genealogical part of this, and so I really, really appreciate it. And I just want to thank you very much. And thanks again to Shaw, Cable, and Spotlight for this. And maybe this is going to lead to some more documentaries and panel discussions. So I'll wish you a good evening, and thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a good night.